Hello. The novels and stories of the Black Library have done enormous work to expand, enrich, and elevate the Warhammer worlds, and my guest today is an author who has worked across all of them. He has written iconic characters like Warhammer Fantasy's Gotrek and Felix and 40k's Fabius Bile, created the Age of Sigmar series Soul Wars, and the would-be series Eight Lamentations. And of course, he was one of the key writers helping to bring about the End Times, with the return of Nagash and the Lord of the End Times Archaon. We talk about how he got started as a writer, what it's like working for Black Library, pitching new stories and taking on briefs, how you expand and work within an existing universe, and some of the trials and tribulations that come from that. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I have the great privilege to be in conversation with author Josh Reynolds. Josh, thanks so much for joining me. I'm always keen to sort of get a bit of an understanding of how you got into the career that you're in and how you sort of began with your exploration of fantasy worlds and science fiction and that sort of stuff. So, where did your interest in fantasy and sci-fi first come from, do you think?
Well, I've always had it, really. My dad was a big science fiction and fantasy junkie in the 70s. So as soon as I got to the age where I could read or be read to, he was reading me Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion. My dad read me The Silmarillion before he read me The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings.
Right,
Which
wow.
does explain some things about me, I think. But I mean, he read mythology. He was reading me stuff like Elric and Niflheim, and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser was always a popular one.
Hmm.
I think those stories have something that appeal to a 10-year-old child.
Right.
More so than Elric and Corum. I learned to appreciate those later in life when I was an angsty teenager. But yeah, he always read that stuff. He read science fiction. He read like the Lensman series, and which is basically just Green Lantern with space dinosaurs. Just all that old school science fiction and fantasy, and he had it all laying around the house. I'd be like, "Oh, I'm bored," and he's like, "Okay, here's Isaac Asimov. Read that. You won't be bored anymore." It's like, no, I'm doubly bored and confused. And then he would give me, Robert Heinlein and just everything, whatever I wanted to read, he would hand it to me off the shelf or go to the library and find it. I was growing up in South Carolina, and we had a lot of really good secondhand bookstores that had huge science fiction and fantasy sections. So you'd go and you'd bring a bag of books in, like to an Oxfam in England. You'd bring a bag of books in to turn in, and they'd go like, "Okay, here's $20 a credit," and then you go on the shelves, and you'd come home with like 30 books.
Right.
So I was pulling off all those, those ace double science fiction books, and like, oh, 2 books for one. That's a savings right there. That's a wise way to spend this credit. I collected all the Conan reissues from Bantam with the Frazetta covers. That was my earliest attempt to collect something. Was because I got the first 2 when I was like, oh, there's a whole series of these with these awesome covers. I got to collect these. And managed to do it, and they paid off a car for me, so that was pretty good.
Wow. Yeah.
But that's basically where it started.
That's
My
great.
dad.
Yeah, like a wide-ranging education in classic sci-fi fantasy, it sounds like.
Oh God, yeah, and in horror fiction as well. I mean, he gave me Lovecraft and Ray Bradbury and all, just everything. The older the better.
Hmm.
He would hand it to me and just like, read this. It's fun.
Yeah. So that,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I'm guessing you're absorbing all of that kind of stuff. When did you start finding yourself putting stuff back out there and sort of becoming a writer, I suppose?
I like telling this story because the cliche is I should say I've always been a writer.
Right.
But the truth is, I didn't start writing until college because I was living in a terrible apartment. Perfect apartment for a college student, terrible for an adult person.
Right.
Black mold up one wall covered entirely black mold. We had to cover it with one of those cheap tapestry images you get from Temu, you know,
Right.
one of those just huge cloth tapestries, and it would ripple occasionally because the mold was shifting. It was
Oh
horrible.
my gosh.
We sprayed it down with bleach and would scrape it every weekend, and then it would come back. Turned out later there was a hidden room back there that they just walled off when they'd made separate apartments, and everyone had forgot about it. So there's just this massive, leaky, drafty bedroom back there.
Oh wow. I mean, that sounds like you were living the start of a horror story there.
It does. Sometimes when we forgot to clean the black mold, we'd wake up in the middle of the night and think it was talking to us. You know. What I'm saying is, it was very toxic, and it was not an environment people should have been living in.
No.
I was in college. I was working 2 jobs, neither of which required me to do very much. I would basically be like managing a fire panel for a performance theater. So I would watch to see whether a fire got started, and then go put the fire out. I found out later, like about a year later, that the fire panel didn't actually work. So I hope no fires were started.
Wow, so you're just watching just a panel that did nothing.
It just did nothing. It's like that episode of The Simpsons, which I'm dating myself. There's an episode of The Simpsons where Homer is changing the light bulbs in the nuclear panel.
Right.
And it is like some of them are just not working, and it's like that's not a good thing. But I was doing all this, and I was still short of money, as one is, because I had car payments, I had car insurance, I had rent, I had all this kind of stuff, and college payments, and I also like to eat on a regular basis. And so I was. This is back during the big boom of the internet. So late 90s, early 2000s, when you've got all these e-zines and webzines and all this stuff popping up. And a lot of them were basically Lovecraftian fan fiction. And I was reading this stuff because I would read it at night on the computer at work, watching the fire panel that didn't work. And I'd be like reading these stories, and I'm like, well, that is literally just a Lovecraft story set in a different place. That is just that story set in a different location. And I checked, and I realized that you could submit to these places, and most of them paid on acceptance. And I realized that I could knock out 4 or 5 stories a month,
right,
and make a grocery bill, make a grocery payment for the month, get help with the car payment. So I started churning out very poor Lovecraftian pastiches in college as a hustle to help pay the way, which led me into doing other writing gigs as a hustle in college. And I say hustle because some of them were not strictly within the boundaries of acceptable writing. I wrote term papers for a little while for people. So they, you'd have people come and go, I took this class. I didn't mean to take it. I have to take it for an elective. I don't know anything about Voltaire.
Right.
I was like, so why are you taking a class about Voltaire? They're like, I don't know. This person was attractive. I was in there. It happened. Now I need a 6-page paper on Voltaire. I'm like, all right, well, that'll be $200. Invite me to the wedding. And I did other stuff. I wrote for underground magazines, college newspaper, just little stuff under various pseudonyms. And it was a good way to make money, but I didn't actually think it was a serious career at the time, because I was like, no, I'm going to get a job working in a factory, or being a salesman like my dad, or working at a bank, or because I was studying anthropology, and I saw no future in that.
Right.
was like, I'm interested. I'm going to study this, and I'm going to be an anthropologist. And it's like, oh, I can't actually get a job in this until someone dies.
Right.
Right. Okay. So I have to wait out. I have to wait out the people who are teaching me anthropology to get a job. All right. So in the meantime, I guess I'll do this other stuff. And that's how I got started.
Right.
It's
And then
it's right. Yeah.
right. So it starts as a bit of a hustle.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to reduce it, but almost taking it liberal influence from Lovecraft and all that kind of stuff, right? And
Yeah.
turn that into new stuff. When did it start to migrate into a more, I guess, like creative expression? When did you find yourself like building your own stories, I suppose?
Around about the same time, I'd been doing the bad stuff. I'd been doing we shall call them pastiches,
Right.
pastiches for about a year, and I started to realize that I had the technical bit of it down, but I was bored.
Mm.
So I started going, I think I can do better than this, and I did. Not it wasn't great, but it was better. I started writing my own stuff. I said, oh, Lovecraft and all these guys have their own world, their own setting. So maybe I should invent a setting. And I was like, I like occult detective stories. Maybe I should invent an occult detective. Maybe I should try that. And that's what I did. I invented a setting that was in South Carolina. That's like the South Carolina backwoods version of Arkham. I invented occult detectives that were initially largely ripoffs of ones from like Manly Wade Wellman and Seabury Quinn had invented, the century previous.
Right.
But because you learn by doing and by aping what you've read and seen,
Sure.
and I aped and figured out what I could do well out of those things, and then I got hooked on writing fan fiction. I wrote a lot of Marvel and DC fan fiction, which also taught me how to write stories that lasted for longer than 5,000 words.
Right.
Because back in the day, these young children don't know about it today, but back in the day when you wrote Marvel fan fiction, it was just like writing a comic book. So you had to plan out like 12 issues, and I put quotes around issues. But you had to plan out like issues and story arcs and characters, and sometimes you couldn't use characters because another fanfic author was using that character.
Right.
And that taught me a lot about how to keep a story going for longer than Lovecraft managed in most cases.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Because I imagine there's a lot. Like when it comes to there's page counts and word counts, right? So
Yep.
you're going to get
Yep.
to a place, especially when you become a professional, of
Yep.
having to actually meet that. No, you need another scene because you need another page.
Yeah, you need another scene because you need to introduce this character. You need to be able to write more than two characters having a conversation.
Right.
3 characters, 4 characters. You need to be able to write action, which is something I've always struggled with because I find action scenes less interesting than dialogue scenes. I'm a person who's never had a problem reading a play. I'm happy to read dialogue, happy to read scripts, happy to read plays. I don't need description or action to really keep me invested. And I tend to skip over fight scenes in books. Happy to watch a movie that's nothing but fight scenes. But reading them in a book is almost. I want something else going on in that fight scene. I want some dialogue. I want some. I don't know, some emotion.
Yeah.
But that's. I kept doing that, and I drifted in and out of writing for the next couple of years, basically until I moved to England. Until I got married. My wife is English, and she did not want to stay in South Carolina for understandable reasons. she wanted to move back to England, and she had a job, and she was like, "Do you want to come with me?" And they was like, "Yeah." And then we got married. I'm skipping a bit, but
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, we got married, and we got there, and we looked at the visa requirements, and it's like you can't have a job when you're getting a visa. You can't have a job for 2 years, because I'd assumed I'd go and I'd get a retail job or something to help, and it was like, no, you can't have a job. She has to support you for 2 years. And I was like, oh well, that's terrible. And my wife pointed out that freelance work wasn't covered under that. You couldn't have a salary job, but I could still write and sell short stories and stuff, because it was a kind of a gray area, and because I was not technically working in England, I was selling stuff elsewhere.
Right.
And I was like, okay. And she was like, well, why don't you just go back to writing? Just do it full time instead of splitting your time between 3 or 4 different jobs. Just do one thing. I was like, all right, we'll give it a try for 2 years. We'll see what happens. And that's when I got a job with Black Library.
Right.
Because they had an open submission period, and I was like, oh, hey, I'm going to write a book based on my limited knowledge of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay and Rogue Trader, and I'll submit some stuff. And I submitted a thing, and they were like, yeah, this is great, but it doesn't work because it's set in Astalia and Araby, and we don't write about Astalia and Araby. And I was like, oh, well, what if we just switch to Norsca and Nordland? And the editor replied like a day later. He was like, what do you mean just switched? I'm like, we just switch. It's the same story. We just flip it. He was like, okay, write the pitch. And I wrote the pitch, and he's like, this is the exact same pitch. And I was like, yeah, but it switched, and now it works, doesn't it? And he was like, yeah, it does. It does work. Okay.
Right.
And that's how I got started writing for Black Library.
Amazing. Then, I mean, because that's obviously like a level of pragmatism. I mean, and
yeah.
I imagine that's quite useful, generally speaking, when you're working in these sorts of shared worlds, right? Of making decisions, not being too precious about stuff, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not being too precious is good, but you have to balance not being precious with being callous, I guess.
Right.
Because there's a fine line between being pragmatic enough to make changes and not caring at all about what you're writing and putting out substandard product. And I hate to call writing a product. I really hate calling it that. I used to not hate. I used to call it product and content all the time, because I wrote a lot of search engine optimization stuff while writing for Black Library.
Right.
And I've since started to kind of go, it's not really a good way to refer to it, because that kind of leads to the situation we're in now with AI and everything else. Kind of had to rethink my pragmatism on that score.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But it's you have to be pragmatic, and you have to have a certain. I had a certain level of thick hide built up by the time I started writing for Black Library, because I'd had rejections, and for every one submission you get accepted, you'll have 10 rejections, and some of those rejections are mean. Most of them are not. Most of them are just no thanks, this isn't for us. But some of them, are like, this is the worst thing that has ever been written in the human history of writing.
Right. Wow.
And it's like, well, that's a bit harsh for my 1,500 word time travel story, but all right.
I mean, how do you build
that under advisement?
Resilience to that? Because that sounds like that could be really, if you're getting, that every now and again, or plenty of rejections over a period of time.
Growing up in the South, you develop a certain mental toughness, a certain resilience of the soul, shall we say?
Right.
But mostly it's just practice. You have to be persistent, and part of persistence is it's like exercise. Exercise hurts if you haven't done it, but once you get past the pain, you hit that point where it doesn't hurt anymore, and it feels good. And writing's the same way. Once you get past the pain of that rejection, you realize that the best thing to do is not feel bad, but just to go, okay, and resubmit it immediately.
Right.
Because there's not necessarily anything wrong with a story that's been rejected. That took me a little while to figure out. Because I would tear apart a story after it had been rejected and go, well, why was it rejected? What was wrong with it? There's got to be something I can fix. And another writer kind of took me aside one day and said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the stories. They're like, the editor just didn't like it. Just submit it somewhere else. And they were right. 9 times out of 10, it gets accepted. The second, third, or fourth place you submit it, it's accepted. And there's nothing wrong with the story. It's just it hasn't found the right market, the right niche to go, the right audience, shall we say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean it's really interesting. So and the Black Library submission obviously is sort of right time, right place, right submission, right editor,
right editor.
Yeah. With those changes. I mean, and then you were just straight into writing like full length novels for Black Library.
Well, I wrote the first novel based on that pitch, which was Night of the Blazing Sun, which came out, and as so many Warhammer Fantasy novels did, came out and vanished
right
immediately. And the editor kind of said, "This is expected. We don't expect you to earn out. There will be more work." And there were short stories, no novels, mostly short stories. I wrote for Hammer and Bolter, which was around at the time. That just started. And about a year or so in, another editor got in touch with me, Lindsay Priestley, who was my main editor for most of my time I was there, got in touch and said, "Do you want to write a Gotrek and Felix novel?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Am I picking up where Nathan Long left off?" And she said, "No, you're not." And I said, "Oh, okay. What am I doing then?" And then she sent me a list of bullet points. She said, "It needs to take place out of canon." I said, "Well, okay, what do you mean by that?" She said, "It can't have anything to do with what's been written previously except Bill King's stuff." I said, "Okay." She said, "It can't be set any time in particular. It has to be set in a general now." I said, "All righty." She said, "It has to involve chaos." I said, "Okay, that's a given." She said, "It has to involve Khorne." I said, "Fine." She said, "It has to involve these new models, the Slaughter Brutes and some other stuff that had just come out." And I was like, "Okay, I can do that." She said, "It has to involve a siege." And I was like, "Okay, that's fine. That's even better." Writes itself. "Has to involve Carrick Cadron." I was like, "Didn't we already do a book about them going to Carrick Cadron?" She's like, "Yes, pretend it didn't happen." And I emailed her back and I was like, you realize that you're setting me up to be tarred and feathered, right?" She said, "Yes." "Let's see how you handle it." I was like, "All right, that's fine. This is what I am now. This is the guy I am. That's fine." So I did it, and it came out, and people were so angry. So angry. People are still angry. If you go on Reddit now and look up Road of Skulls, the first Gotrek and Felix book I do, there are still people who are angry about it to this day. Just so angry. I feel so bad for them. It's like, I did not mean to make you this angry for so long.
Yeah. I mean,
and yeah.
Well, it's interesting, with those kinds of, would briefs be as specific as that quite frequently, or is that because obviously that's meeting a specific vision that's been laid out, or a business requirement that's been laid out. Okay, we need a Gotrek and Felix novel that's going to tick these boxes for this reason. Yeah. So is that what you would see like quite often, or would it be a bit freer than that?
With Lindsay, it was often that way.
Right.
Early on, it was often that way because they would have kind of what I wasn't pitching anything. What I was doing is being said, they were saying, "We need a story for this," or "We need a book." Like the vampire books I wrote, Neferata and Master of Death, were the same way. They were, "We need follow-ups to these books, that move the characters forward, that deal with these pivotal events in the time of Legends." And beyond that, there was kind of like, it would be like 2 or 3 bullet points, and it was like, go nuts beyond that. The Gotrek and Felix stuff was always a little more, because they were more careful about Gotrek and Felix, because it was like a tentpole Warhammer novel. So even the short stories would kind of be like, "Oh, we need a short story that involves Gotrek and Felix and halflings," or "We need a short story that involves Gotrek and Felix and Snorri. We need a this, and that, and the other.
Hmm.
And most of the time, the briefs were just that. They were brief. They were like 1 or 2 bullet points. Cover this within those bounds. Do whatever you want.
Hmm.
And that was pretty much what my career was like for right up until the End Times, was just following a brief. And then we hit the End Times, and
sure,
things went pear-shaped very rapidly.
I mean, just sort of exploring that. I mean, I suppose almost that. I don't want to sort of be reductive, but almost like a work for hire kind of approach, perhaps. Editors are coming up with ideas, or the studio saying we need this story to tackle this particular issue. I mean, did you get any sense of like why those stories were necessary at those given times? Why did Gotrek and Felix have to be disconnected from previous canon, or why did we need these stories in the time of Legends? Were they literally just coming from a business sort of analysis that had said the market is open to this, so that's what we're going to create? Or was there some other purpose driving those briefs, do you think?
At the time, I didn't know. When I was writing with Black Library, everything was very siloed. So Black Library didn't really know what games design was doing. Games design didn't really know what the miniature designers were doing. It might still be that way. I don't know. But when I was there, it was extremely hard to get anything out of anyone who wasn't in your direct hierarchy.
Right.
So what Lindsay would try her best at the time to kind of give me what I needed. Like, she was really good about going back to old codexes and old army books, and sending me photocopies and stuff of what I needed. Because at times it would be, we need you to write about this. And I'd be like, okay, so can I use these sources? And they'd go, no.
Right.
So like, I'm supposed to invent it. No. So what sources am I using? None. So what am I doing? The best you can.
Right. Wow. So,
okay.
I mean, is that the sort of thing, if you were like, okay, I want to refer back to something from one of the original GW books. Say I want to put Drakenfels into this novel, for instance.
Yeah.
That's where you were sort of getting into that kind of thing. Like, we can't refer to this, or you must refer to that.
Yeah, it would. It was one of those cases where it was better to ask forgiveness than permission a lot of times. And if it was something that genuinely shouldn't be in there, the editor would let you know, and you take it out and rewrite it. But a lot of it was just safer not to include stuff from previous editions, because you didn't know whether it would be rewritten in the very next edition or erased. And we were trying to keep things as loosely consistent as possible.
Right.
So not canon, because obviously Games Workshop doesn't have canon. As they've said many, many times, there is no canon, but consistency. So you were trying to make sure that if Firmir, for instance, were mentioned here, should we refer to that mention or connect it to that, or should we start fresh? Or, if Neferata in this army book, it says she went here and did this at this date, and then here and this at this date, and then you go to the next army book in line and it says she went and did this and this and this and this instead in these dates. Am I supposed to try and synergize? Oh God, I hate that word. Sorry. Am I supposed to synthesize, synergize, meld these two timelines for something that fits both, or follow the older one or follow the newer one? And that was what a lot of the discussions with editors would be about.
Right.
How do I make this fit, and should I bother to make it fit? Does anyone care if I make it fit? And the answer is yes. Yes, people do care. Sure, and they get very angry, and they write you, 5,000 word emails about why you were wrong and should die.
Right.
Because that was a good one for Road of Skulls. Going back to that, that was a good one. A guy sent me a 5,000 word email about how I got dwarf women wrong.
Right.
I still have that email. It is a thing of great beauty. It is magnificent in the sheer venom and almost academic snobbery
Right.
that this man sent me. Dwarf woman would never do the stuff. Like, where are your sources, man? I need these sources. Oh God.
Yeah,
What are you people reading that I'm not?
I guess that must be a one of the challenges of working within these kinds of pre-existing worlds, especially one that, like you say, doesn't have a hard and fast canon, like comics, like you were talking about with the those fanzines.
Yeah.
It's a rolling canon, if it's any kind of canon, isn't it? Where it evolves and changes with every new release, every new story.
Yeah.
But there are going to be fans who have read everything or have read a selection of things and have taken and internalized that canon. So, I mean, was that the sort of extent of your interactions with them? Is it just sort of seeing complaints and sort of seeing emails, or how do you sort of bridge that gap with the fan expectations, I suppose?
Well, this is also when Twitter got started. So, let me say this: 99.9% of my interactions with fans over the years have been wonderful, life-affirming things. But there's that 0.01% that really, 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 really want me to die in a fire. Because, whenever I sat down to write something that's based on a property like this, what I want to do is provide the best experience possible for the reader, any reader. And that does mean that when I was writing for Warhammer, I would dig back into old codexes, I would dig back into old army books and try and find something that could connect the old stuff to the new stuff. Because that's how you sell the new stuff. Is you make people remember, you remind people that of the old stuff just enough to get them on the new stuff. If there are changes to the dwarves, you remind them of all the stuff they like about the dwarves from previous editions, and you connect that to the new stuff. And you try and make it as organic and natural as possible, which is difficult sometimes, because sometimes it's just a cool model, and that's what it is. It's they've developed a cool model, and now it needs rules, and now it needs to be organically inserted into the storyline. And that was the tie-in writer's job. That our job is to make sense of the rule of cool stuff and make it fit. And sometimes that's really easy, and sometimes it's extremely difficult, and you get paid the same regardless. So,
I mean that sort of exploration, I suppose, of the world, because that is one of the things I think people enjoy most about this kind of expanded fiction. As you mentioned, a tie-in sort of fiction line, it gives it more depth and more breadth to a game that you love, right? Or a movie or a comic or whatever else it might be. So, I mean, is there an aspect of it that's quite fun as a writer to be able to play with those toys in new ways? To like delve into the toy box of the Warhammer world and say, oh, well, I'm a big fan of this or that or the other. I'm going to use that in my next story.
Oh yeah, definitely. I had great fun writing so many of the short stories and stuff I did, just because I wrote a bunch of short stories based around Marienburg. Marienburg had no presence in the war game. Like it might have a mention in a rule book, but it wasn't a faction or anything. But in the role playing game, it had a bunch of really neat stuff. And I would always dive into that and go, oh, this is such a great setting, because it's Amsterdam. It's got the canals, and it's got the underdocks, and it's got the mutants and shark gods and all this kind of interesting stuff. all the little hooks from like the Realm of Chaos books,
Mm.
which I had, all the old Morkockian flourishes, the older 2000 AD flourishes to some of this stuff. And you dig into that and like, this is ridiculous and fun and great, and let's bring some of that back. Let's put some more of that into what I'm writing. And then you go a little bit too far, and an editor would kind of send a note going, maybe pull that back a little bit. Let's ground that a little more. And I'm like, what, the Chaos Champion covered in purple orifices? No. They're like, no, let's maybe purple mouths. Could you say mouths, not orifices? Could you say mouths? I'm like, but technically they are orifices. They're like, no, mouths. We'll just let's smooth that out. But yeah, it is so much fun. It's so much fun sometimes that you forget it's work, which was the best time. The best time is when everything's firing on all cylinders and you're having so much fun and you're getting paid to do it. I'm getting paid to write about plastic soldiers. This is great. This is the best job in the world. Yeah.
And then you mentioned that then the End Times came along, and obviously Nagash and the writing of that. You also said that that's when things went a bit pear-shaped. I mean, what did you mean by that? What was that experience like, I suppose?
Okay, so after Return of Nagash, that was the first time that Black Library decided I was surplus to requirements.
Right.
Which was it was a very sad thing, but they were like, Warhammer World's ending. You're not a Warhammer 40K guy. You're a Warhammer Fantasy guy. We're not going to have any more fantasy stuff after the End Times. So for the foreseeable, creative has nothing for you, to quote a wrestler I know. And I was like, okay, this was a fun run. I had a couple of years. I'll move on. And then, obviously, about 3 or 4 weeks later, Black Library emailed me and was like, "We need somebody to write the last one." I was like, but you had somebody to write the last one. They're like, yeah, they don't want to write it. So, do you want to destroy everything? I was like, let me refer you to my email exchange from Road of Skulls. You do realize that you're setting me up to be tarred and feathered. They were like, yes. Do you mind? I was like, I guess not. If someone's got to do it, it might as well be me. And, money. So pragmatism, again, rearing its head.
Sure.
And that was that last End Times book. Like the Return of Nagash was really fun because I had a very loose brief. I had a roadmap in the game book. The game book had already been written. It was already ready to go. I had a very nice roadmap I could follow, and I could build up characters within that roadmap, which is what I did. All the characters that are in that book are actually in the game book. I just gave them personalities that they might have had a one-word mention or one-line mention, and I just kind of went, oh, this guy's got a cool name. I'll give him a backstory, and we'll do something with him. And then Lord of the End Times came, and I was like, all right, well, where's the game book? And they're like, it's not finished. I was like, okay. So what do you want me to write? They're like, just do what you can, and we'll send you stuff as it's finished. It's like, oh, all right. And they had like, I joke, but they had like the first half of the book finished. So I had a roadmap for like the first 2/3 of the novel. But there were a lot of discrepancies and things got changed. There was an elf that got clearly turned into a vampire in the Nagash book. And no one knew what happened to her because they wouldn't send me copies of the other army books or the other game books. Like they refused to send them to me. Games Design refused to send them to Black Library because they were afraid of leaks. Black Library didn't want to send me any more than I actually needed to write because they thought that I was going to leak. And I was like, who am I going to leak to? I'm not exactly persona grata here. so I was filling in the gaps and trying to do what I could and inventing stuff, and then stuff would come out and they'd be like, oh yeah, she was turned into the new elven goddess of death. I was like, when did that happen? Where was that in the pile of information you sent me? And they were like, we skipped it. Nobody cares. Don't worry about it. I was like, oh god. They're like, okay. I was like, well, what happened to Skarsnik? It's like, don't worry about him. Oh, but everyone wants an ending. You got to let me give people an ending. It's like they're gonna break my thumbs.
I mean, it must have been like quite a frustrating process then, quite challenging at the very least, to be working in that way.
It was also incredibly exhilarating because there was a lot of, we don't know what's happening and we don't have any plans, so just do what you can.
Right.
And so many things I made up were just completely wrong. And just like not what happened at all in the books, in the game book, and they were completely different. And what was unusual is they didn't get changed because there was no time, because everything was such a tight deadline. Like I wrote that book in like 3 weeks. That's a massive book, and I was just writing day and night. This was before I had a kid, so I was writing until like 1 a.m., 2 a.m.
Right.
I was getting up at 9. I was up at 6 and going to bed at like 3, and then getting up and starting all over again the next day.
Wow.
And I would send off what I'd written, and they would send it back with edits. So I was editing it while I was writing it, which is difficult to do, because sometimes they'll send you an edit that only makes sense if you change something earlier on in the book, which has already been okayed and sent in. So you have to send in an email going, you need to send me that bit back so that I can input this edit that you've decided on. I was having fun because I knew it was my last book and I wasn't going to have to worry about it anymore. I was done. I was out. Nobody, I was like, my career with Black Library is done after this. I'm going out. I'm blowing up the world. I'm leaving and blowing up the world behind me. Gone. And that didn't happen.
Well, sure, yeah.
Actually, technically, it did. The second time they decided I was surplus to requirements is after Lord of the End Times came out, and I got an email going, well, that's it. You're done. Thanks for, you did it. You did a good job. We appreciate it. And I was like, it was great. I enjoyed it. Let's never speak of this again. And, and then obviously later on, I started doing 40K stuff, which was, it's always fun.
Yeah. I mean, just on that, the sort of end of the Warhammer world, and obviously, there's lots of elements of closure within the books and within the End Times story. And like you say, there's a bit of there's some conflicting aspects of it. One thing that you did try and do that seemed to be to sort of help the fans out as well was, once that story had come out, you did publish your own perspective, I suppose, on what might have happened to other characters that were not detailed within the books, right?
Oh God, that got me in so much trouble. Yeah. Largely because there was so much stuff that was just left unexplored. By necessity of the story they were telling, there just wasn't room to cover all these side characters. Like I had an argument with the editor at the time about including Bruner the Bounty Hunter from C.L. Werner's books in the last End Times novel. And I was like, it would make sense that he'd be there because he's still around and he's still a character in there. And it was like, yeah, but he's not very important. And it's like, well, he's important to me and to a lot of people. So let's include him. Let's include Matthias Thulman. Let's include some characters. She was a grave robber, and I forget her name now because it's been a while since I've read the books.
Fleischer.
Yeah. I was like, let's include the Blackhearts. Yeah, Angelica Fleischer. Let's include the Blackhearts, her. Let's get all these characters in. And I couldn't. There wasn't room in the story, and some of them, they just would, like the Fleischer stuff just got no-sold immediately. Like I said, let's include this, and they're like, no.
Right.
I was like, let's include the Blackhearts. No. All right. Um, and so the answers were kind of my way of going, I'm going to try my best to help you come up with suitable endings for these characters you love. None of it's canon. None of it's official. This is just fan fiction. This is just me, trying to ease the pain of what was a, it was ending the Warhammer world was not handled as well as it could have been, because originally the End Times Black Library's portion of the End Times was going to be this long thing of books and audios and novellas and short stories. All this stuff was planned out. There were meetings with all the authors who were involved, and we were like, they're going to be audios, and they're going to be, we pitching novellas and short stories to go between all the books. And there was going to be this big push to really do it right. There was going to be a story about the huntsman, the Imperial huntsman. He's a character in Total War 3. I don't remember his name now. But his thing was he was hunting the brass bull. And that was his background. That was his story in the army book, is he's hunting Taurox the brass bull.
Right.
And that was going to be a short story. That was his final confrontation with the brass bull. Boris Todbringer's final confrontation with Kazarek One-Eye. The final confrontation of so many characters who were set up as opposing figures. There was there was a dark elf swordsman who had a grudge against somebody, and
sure,
the army
yes.
book, and that was going to happen, and it was all, and so little of it got done. There were a few short stories, but 90% of what we planned out just got left on the floor.
Wow. Because you said that was going to be a long sort of process then. So was there an original vision for that? What's like a year or longer?
Oh, like 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
The original vision was like a book a year, and then ancillary material around it.
Right.
So like Return of Nagash would be a build up, the book would come out, and then we'd have stories and audios, because there was going to be, I was asked to pitch 9 stories about the 9 Mortarchs.
Right.
So it would be a story about each. So, about Neferata, about Luther Harkon, about whoever, Arkan. What was the guy on the Manticore?
With Dieter?
Yeah, Dieter was it Helsnicht?
Yes. Yeah.
The Doom Lord of Middenheim.
That's right.
And all that was going to be, each of them was going to get a short story, and there was going to be an audio that was, it was a Manfred audio, where it was him basically arguing with himself about having released Nagash. And then, Vlad was going to show up, and it was going to be the first time Vlad had an audio interpretation, because Manfred had audio stuff prior. But it was going to be the first time Vlad was on an audio and Nagash was on an audio, and it was so great. And then all of that was just like, we went into that meeting, and it was pumped. Everybody was pumped and ready. It's like, this is terrible, but we're going to make it the best we can. And then like a week later, you get an email going, none of that's happening.
Right.
Absolutely none of this stuff is happening. Forget everything from that meeting. Write the book. That's all you're doing.
Wow. I mean, did you ever get a sense of why that was all pulled?
I think they were just in a hurry. My opinion is that they were just in a hurry to get it done. It was like pulling a Band-Aid off. Quicker you do it, the less painful it is. That was the theory. Which is a shame, because I think if they'd done it, they'd stuck to the original plan, people would have accepted it. People would have had time to come to terms with it.
Yeah.
That they didn't originally, because it all came out in a year, didn't it? Like 5 books came out in a year.
Yeah.
And originally, like I said, it was supposed to be 2 or 3 years, I think, according to them, because that was the only way we were going to get all that material written.
Right.
And it was just, yeah. And that's why I did the question and answer stuff, was because I was like, it really sucks that this stuff has ended the way it has. it's not an ideal situation, so I'm going to try and be fan friendly. I'm going to try and do what I can. And then Games Workshop said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I'm like, "Well, I've already said it's fanon. It's not serious. Nobody cares." And they're like, "It's on every message board." They're taking this as gospel because you're a Black Library author. And I'm like, "But I'm not a Black Library author anymore." And they said, "Who told you that?" I was like, "Well, you did. You sent me an email." They were like, "Shut up. Stop doing it. Cancel it. Write this White Scars novella. Be quiet." Oh, fine. Jesus.
Do you
I'll
think
just
that
make more money.
Yeah, sure. There was no relationship there between stop talking about this, we're going to distract you and give you this to write instead.
I actually have always wondered about that, because
Right.
it was kind of that. I think that some people were sympathetic to what I was trying to do. And I think that was kind of their way of going, let's give him something else to occupy him. Because if we don't, he's just going to kind of keep writing fan fiction. unless we send him an actual cease and desist letter, it's going to continue. And by the end there, I was actually getting I'm kind of glad they caught me when they did, because by the end I was just given like people's fan-made characters endings, and none of it made sense.
Right.
I was like, I don't even know who this character is. And they're like, "Oh no, he's been around for like 3 editions." I was like, "Oh, it's a fan-made army book." That okay, yeah, I'm just spitballing here. I'm trying my best here. And it was just like, I don't know who this character is, but by God, I'm going to give him an epic ending. By God, you're going to get the ending you deserve.
But then you moved into, so you were writing 40k stuff, and obviously you would go into Age of Sigmar and stuff as well.
Yeah.
I mean, how did they differ? So 40k, how did that differ to working on Warhammer Fantasy, or was it quite similar in a way?
It was actually a lot more. There was a lot more oversight for it. Yeah. So they were very definite. Like the editor I had at the time was very much of the opinion that I should come to him before I had any wild ideas. And he was like, "You wrote some really good Warhammer Fantasy stories. It's like, I need you to keep a leash on it and run things by me before you use them or do them. And this will be so much easier." And it was. And it was a lot easier to kind of stick to the brief. But there was also a lot more miscommunication, just because 40k is the popular, was the flagship at that point. Still is, I think. And so things could be changed really quickly. And like with the End Times, they wouldn't necessarily let us know that things had changed, because it wouldn't occur to the game team to let Black Library know that something had changed, because they probably didn't know that we were writing a book based on it.
Right.
So there was a lot of that to get used to, but again, it was just more of the same. Really, just it was just more of the same is a good way of saying it. It's
sure.
More of it, a lot more of it. The pay was better,
right?
So I was happy to do it.
That's interesting. So there were different pay bands based on. Was that based on your experience, or was that based on, like, if you're writing a Warhammer Fantasy novel, it's going to sell less, so the rates are lower? That kind of calculate.
I have been told both.
Okay.
I don't know. I've spent my entire time with Black Library trying to figure out when and why I would get a pay increase for my advances.
Right.
And mostly what I figured out was, if they had something they really needed me to do, and I decided to choose that moment to ask for more money, I would get more money.
Right.
That's all I figured out.
Sure. Okay.
It's like a mercenary being hired to invade a capital. They're like, we really need you to take that capital to capture the Pope, and he's like, but maybe a little more money to capture the Pope and bring him in alive.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then you also moved into the Age of Sigmar. I mean, I'm curious about writing for that universe because it was so new, right? And you're essentially, there's a lot of ground to claim, I suppose, and characters to create, and you're not beholden in the same way you might be with Warhammer Fantasy, where you've got all that history, or 40k, where I assume there's more protectiveness of what exists.
Well, there's more history as well,
of course,
but it was very odd because when Age of Sigmar started, it was very, like you said, it was very, nothing was set. We really only had Chris Wright's, Black Library wise, we only had Chris Wright's novella to go on. We didn't even know if the Stormcast were human when we were pitched the idea. And then I finally read the novella and I'm like, okay, he takes his helmet off. He's clearly a person. But they didn't know anything. All they had were the models. They didn't have any background other than what was in the little booklets. Just nothing. And what we were told at the time, initially, was that Black Library was going to be doing all of the heavy lifting for the world building. So all of the background, all of the lore, that was all going to be Black Library. And that shifted, because at the time there was a big shift in how Black Library functioned. It became an arm of the publications department of Games Workshop. So rather than having an editor, I had a team of editorial staff who would send me a brief and say, we need a story about the Hammers of Sigmar fighting Khornate. Include Skaven. And that was Black Rift of Klaxis. Or we need Seraphon versus Skaven Pestilence, because Skaven Pestilence is getting, the plague monks are getting an army book. So Seraphon versus Skaven Pestilence. And then I kind of went back to them and I'm like, have we explained what Seraphon are yet? They're like, not really. So can I include Stormcast? They're like, if you think so, include them. I'm like, because we need something, just so I can avoid having to do the heavy lifting. Because that was another thing is we were simultaneously expected to do the heavy lifting, but also expected to run everything by the people in charge.
Right.
So every creation for the Age of Sigmar, every bit of world building had to be run by somebody. And sometimes they just wouldn't respond because they were busy doing other things.
Right.
And eventually I just stopped asking. So I just stopped running things by people. Which is why the Eight Lamentations, the person in charge of the Sigmarite Church is a woman. That got somebody mad. Somebody got really mad about that. I never heard directly from them. I heard from somebody else who was like, "Yeah, you really made somebody angry."
Right. What in the editorial team, the studio?
In the studio, because I had invented a bunch of backstory for the Church of Sigmar that they hadn't. They basically wanted us to write about things without writing about them. So they wanted us to mention the Free Guild, but not go into any detail about the Free Guild. They wanted us to mention the Sigmarite Church without going into any detail about it, which, as you know, if you're trying to world build and create a living setting for people to enjoy, is impossible. So you have to know what the coinage is. You have to know all these little bits and pieces, even if you don't use them, so that it has some life. And early on, we were kind of expected to not do that.
Right.
Which is why so much of that early stuff is very kind of smashy, fight. Only the faithful. Smashy, only the faithful.
Right.
We are the storm.
Sure.
As a side note, I've always imagined the "We Are the Storm" battle cry sung to the tune of "We Are the World." I hope that ruins it for somebody.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. But yeah, that was early days of Age of Sigmar were very strange. I actually kind of liked it because the editorial team at the time were very open to ideas, and they were very like all they really expected was for me to follow the brief, turn it in on time to the word count, and they were happy to have that. They didn't want to argue about anything. They didn't want to like have a week-long discussion, an email discussion about some little point in the story. They trusted me to do it, which was nice. After my work on 40K of it kind of being, you're a dirty Warhammer fantasy writer. We don't trust you with Space Marines. We're going to let you write the Space Marines nobody likes, but you're not getting anywhere near the good ones. You filthy, filthy peasant. Which, incidentally, is also what Aaron Dinsky-Bowden called me the first time you met me. Filthy peasant. Myself, I think he was just jealous because of my full head of hair. But, moving on.
I mean, you mentioned the 8 Lamentations, right? And that as an Age of Sigmar, so there's some short stories, there's the novel as well. That was thought by some to be quite a nice, almost, the series that could have been the real grounding and expansion of the Age of Sigmar setting. That allowed characters to explore lots of different aspects of the worlds, the mortal realms, and would have driven a lot more of the world building over a series of novels. And it seems like there were a series planned. So I was curious what happened with that.
What happened with that is they had all the confidence in the world in it, and gave it a big push, and there were big things planned, and then plans changed. Which is really, if you ever find yourself asking why something happened with Black Library, the answer is because plans changed. Somewhere along the way, someone decided that this wasn't what we were going to do. And I don't know, like for 8 Lamentations, I do not know what it was. It was well received. It sold. It didn't sell gangbusters, which is the only reason I can think of that they might have decided to cut their losses. It sold well. It just took it about 2 or 3 years to earn out, which is about standard for a non-tie-in fantasy novel. So it was doing what it could with what it had been given. I think if what they were hoping was it would have been a Gaunt's Ghosts, like it would have smashed records and sold out, and then it would have gone well, but it sold well enough, but not excellent. And then second edition was starting to come out, and they were kind of like, okay, we'll just wipe our hands of it and reboot. So because instead of writing the second 8 Lamentations book, I wrote Soul Wars,
right,
instead, which was a surprising success and continues to be a surprising success,
right.
Which they did a massive push for Soul Wars. Like, it got released in every format, it got released in multiple languages all at once to push the second edition of the game, and sold really well. And then I talked to not one of the marketers I knew, a different marketer for Games Workshop. They're like, I have no idea why this book did so well. And I'm like, because it got released in multiple languages and multiple formats so that everyone could have a copy in their preferred format. He was like, no, that doesn't sound right. I was like, I hope you're joking. He was like, I am joking. I have no idea why it sold so well. It's like, okay. It's always a mystery to me. Black Library have this very weird habit. And they might still have it. I don't know if they still have it, because obviously I am not privy to what goes on in Black Library and have not been for several years. But they had a habit of building things up as a series and making things the first of a series very clearly the first of a series, and then never releasing anything else, which is really annoying if you're a writer and if you're a reader. Dark Harvest was another one that was supposed to be a series, the first book in the series, the horror novel. It was not originally intended. It was originally intended to be the first in the series. I wrote it. They decided they didn't like what I'd written, so I had to rewrite it completely. I rewrote it completely. The editor at the time looked at it and went, "Why did you take out all this stuff?" And I'm like, "Because you told me to." They were like, "Oh, no, put it back in." So I put some of it back in, and they were like, "But he dies at the end." Spoiler alert. He was supposed to die at the end. And they were like, "Oh, you know, it needs to be a series. It needs to be the first in the series." I'm like, "Okay." I was like, is there going to be a second book in the series? They're like, yeah. So I rewrote the ending. I was like, okay, should I pitch the next one now? And they're like, "Oh, no, it's not going to be a series." Like, literally like 2 weeks difference. I was like, that's how fast things change and can change working with this stuff is because it's multiple people in the decision chain and it ripples up and down. And I was like, so, you know, can we change, you know, is there time to change it back to the original ending where he dies and just close it off? She was like, no, we might want to use him. You know, the editor's like, we might want to use him later. I was like, but not me. She was like, no, probably not you.
Right.
Like, all right. Okay, that's fine. I'm happy because if there's a series with the character, you're still going to sell the first book, so I'm still going to make money. So I don't mind. Again, pragmatism. Always pragmatism. Yeah. But it's that you gotta be quick and you gotta adapt and you gotta be able to roll with the punches when you do tie-in stuff.
Yeah, it certainly sounds it. And that's an interesting point about the series, because it does feel like pretty much everything is pitched from Black Library, is pitched as, right, we're going to do a series. You know, and things are set up in that way. Is that just a general thing of tie-in media, do you think? Is it like we'll create it so it can be a series if it's successful?
I think there's part of that. I think it's also Black Library. I am of the opinion that Black Library is constantly attempting to recapture the magic of Gotrek and Felix and Gaunt's Ghosts.
Right.
So they desperately want that new Gaunt's Ghosts. With, you know, that, how many books is it now? 100, 200? You know, how long is that series now? But that's what they want. They want that long-running series that people care about, and people come to conventions dressed as the characters, and that they can repackage as omnibuses every 3 years. That's what they want. They want that long-running IP. And they can't quite make it work for various reasons. They haven't figured out the magic formula to it yet. And honestly, the magic formula was probably Mark Gascon. So, yeah. Dan Abbott at Mark Gascon. There you go. That was the magic formula.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
surprise! I figured it out.
You've mentioned in a few places that Blood Bowl was one of your favorite settings, and that, you know, given the opportunity to write anything you would want, it would be Blood Bowl. I was just curious, what is it about the game, the setting, that appeals so much?
I like writing humor. I like having characters that are funny. I like having funny situations. And for Warhammer Fantasy, I could get humor in a lot because Warhammer Fantasy has a lot of humor baked into it. For 40K, there was less so. It's starting to come back, I think. Robert Rath and someone else wrote some Necron stuff that's got some humor in it, some of the old humor in it. Good books, by the way. Robert Rath's Necron books are excellent. People should read them. But it was just, it was the humor. It was the humor and the ridiculousness. And there's so much to play off of pop culture wise. I think Warhammer, all the Warhammer settings are at their best when they can play off pop culture, because they're built off liberally borrowing from various elements of pop culture, and it's at its strongest when it can reflect those things. I think it's at its weakest when it is too self-referential and it's not referring to other stuff that influenced it. And Blood Bowl is very pop culture. It's very referential. There are so many sports movies that you can refer to, so many novels, so much real world stuff that could go into a Blood Bowl story. Like the idea I kept pitching and never got anywhere with was, let me do audios. That's the play-by-plays with Jim and Bob. And you have the stuff going on in the background. You have the game going on in the background, but like these little, because Black Library used to release these wonderful little like 15-minute audios for Christmas and for the holidays. You know, they'd have a little week of audios, and they'd be like these little 15, 20-minute audios. Like, let me just do a play-by-play of Jim and Bob in the booth, and it'll be kind of like that Mitchell and Webb sketch where they're the snooker announcers, you know, and you have just the relationship, because that's a good relationship. Those two characters have a really good back and forth in the rule books. Let's bring it to audio. Let's have them go back and forth, you know, and banter, and then have a goblin go through the screen, you know, and do that and bring some of that humor. And it was just, no, I got to write 2 stories. That was it. And that's probably my biggest regret. Those are the things I enjoyed working on the most. And also the biggest regret I have is that I just could not convince them to let me do more Blood Bowl. I have dreams about it sometimes at night where I'll be like, if I just said the right thing to the right person at the right time, I could have had a whole Blood Bowl series. I could have done it.
Yeah.
And it just was not meant to be.
I mean, that sounds like a really fun pitch, like the Jim and Bob, the audio approach. Yeah, it's a shame that didn't come off.
Well, it's like you said with the first book. It's, you got to have the right person at the right time and the right editor, and those events just were not in alignment. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like, you know, a lot of ups and downs, really interesting work over the course of your career with Black Library. I mean, having now left, do you ever sort of reflect on which aspects of it were your favorite? You know, what was the best part of writing in those worlds, I suppose?
Yeah, it was. I really enjoyed most of what I did for Black Library. There were a couple of projects that I wrote because they asked me to, or I needed the money, more so than because I wanted to do it. I enjoyed all of it. I mean, I enjoyed most of it, even the stuff that drove me to distraction. There's only one book out of all of them I wrote that I hate with an absolute fiery passion, which is Dark Harvest, which was coincidentally pretty much the last book I wrote for him. Absolutely despise it, hate it. Right. I'm glad people like it. I'm glad people enjoy it. But anytime anyone says it's their favorite book, I'm just like, I understand. I'm glad it's your favorite book. I'm glad you bought it. I'm so glad that you bought it and love it. Please stop talking about it. Please leave me alone.
Is that because it was one of your last pieces for Black Light? Like, does it have that connotation?
Yeah. It's steeped in. My last years with Black Library were not altogether pleasant ones. It had more ups and downs. It had more downs than ups. Just for a variety of reasons, none of which are important anymore, really. But it was a tough last two or 3 years with them, and Dark Harvest is kind of the culmination of the point where I reached the I have to go now. You know, I must go now. My planet needs me. I cannot remain here. I must move on. It was yeah. So it's kind of that. It's the reminder of, if I'd been a bit more a bit more capable of grinning and bearing it, I could have had a career that continued with Black Library. And but because I'm not really good at grinning and bearing it, I'm more the bite the hand off kind of person. Oh, you oh, you're mad at me? Well, I'm double mad at you. Kind of guy. So it was kind of that. That's the point where everything kind of boiled over, and so that's really the only point of my career. That's the really only thing of my time with Black Library I look back at and go, yeah, that was an absolute horror show. Everything else had good points. Like even the End Time stuff had some really good points. Lots of good back and forth. Lots of talking. I always enjoyed talking to the other writers, even if I suspect they hadn't, no idea what I was talking about half the time. I made so many great relationships with authors I still talk to, like Jim Swallow, who's a great guy. People should definitely read his books, by the way. But it was, ups and downs, and frankly, I would do it all over again in a heartbeat. Possibly with some changes, like pushing for Blood Bowl very early on.
Well, I mean, in more recent years, you found yourself teaming up again with Mark Gascoigne when he was at Aconite, to write things like Arkham Horror and Legend of the Five Rings. So yes. I was curious how that sort of, I suppose, how that came to be, and how that differs, I suppose, from working on the other sort of world.
Well, they approached me, which was a surprise, about writing for Aconite when Aconite was getting started. They were trying to put together a stable of writers to kick things off. And really what interested me about it was that there was going to be that myriad of IPs. So you had Arkham Horror and Legend of the Five Rings, which are two completely different IPs. Just in tone and setting and everything. And I like the idea of being able to write a bunch of different stuff, because I was at the time I was getting very, not bored, but kind of exhausted by 40K. I was writing a lot of Space Marine stuff, and I don't like Space Marines. I've never, I'm not shy about saying that. I don't like them. I find them kind of boring. Like, I really like the Rogue Trader Space Marines, where they're basically just drugged up thugs and power armor. I think they're really interesting. I do not find monkish warrior brotherhood in space that intriguing. There are other writers who do. I'm just kind of like, just let me write something else. Let me write some Rattlings. Let me do something. Let me write some pirates.
Yeah.
So this was a good opportunity to kind of stretch my muscles and do some different stuff. And I've been I love Arkham Horror. I've been playing it for a while. There was nothing better to me in my college years than setting up 3 or 4 Arkham Horror expansions, taking that 6 hours you needed to set up all those expansions, and then playing for 20 minutes until the great old one ate you. And Legend of the Five Rings, I played some of that because that's old, that's 30, 40 years. I played that once or twice. And I was kind of interested. Because they came to talk to me about it. They're like, what would you like to write? And I'm like, well, I'd like to do something different. I don't want to necessarily mess with the magic and the high fantasy aspects. I'd like to do something a bit more ground level. And I was like, like something like a detective novel. And they said, well, what kind of detective novel? I'm like, gentleman detective. Peter Wimsey, nobleman investigating crimes that deal with the nobility and politics and stuff. They're like, all right, sold. That sounds perfect. And Arkham Horror was the same thing. Like, Arkham Horror, my original pitch was taking one of the characters, the standard characters, I think the reporter. And I was like, let's do kind of a Carl Kolchak, Night Stalker thing with Rex Mason, I think is the reporter. I'm not sure. he's got the camera, and it's like 1920s. He's a reporter. He can go everywhere. He doesn't have to stay in Arkham. He can go all over the world investigating mythos stuff. I was like, that's a great setup. And they're like, we don't really want to use those characters. Can you invent a character? And I was like, okay. I was watching a lot of Miss Fisher's murder mysteries at the time.
Mm.
I was like, lady thief, gentlewoman thief, comes to Arkham to steal something and then gets involved in mythos stuff, and we go from there. And that's how all that came about. It was just like a lunch meeting where I pitched a bunch of ideas, and they were like, we like those 2 ideas, write up a pitch.
Yeah.
And I wrote a pitch, and that was like, again, with like my first time with Black Library, it was basically, they would go, this doesn't work for us. And I go, well, how about this? Or this, or this? Choose from among these options. Allow me to plug them into the story engine, and we'll see which one works for you. I like to provide a buffet for editors and publishers. They may pick and choose and create the plate they wish.
Well, I mean, I'm very pleased to hear you mention Lord Peter Wimsey there as well, because I'm a big fan of your Daidoji Shin stories.
Thank you.
And I absolutely picked up on that influence. So I'm glad to hear that was part of it. I mean,
I love Dorothy Sayer. I love her. Dorothy Sayers is just one of my favorite authors.
Fantastic author, and great crime novels.
Yes.
You've done a few of the Shin stories now.
Yes.
And you don't have to answer this, but is there a potential future where we might see more from whether it's that series or more L5R stuff down the line, or even more Arkham Horror stuff down the line, I suppose?
I am waiting to hear back for all of that.
Okay.
Essentially there are plans, like I and my editor for Aconite sat down and planned out about 15 or 16 Shin novels, just so we would have ideas to pick and choose from for the however many books there tended to be.
Right.
And so I'm waiting to hear back to see whether there is going to be another one, or whether it's going to end with the recently released A Bitter Taste, which is, meant to be an ending, but also kind of a jumping off point for a new set of stories. With Shin and a new cast of characters for a new dynamic, I guess. Moving from Gentleman Detective to more Peter Wimsey, Harriet Vane, or the Thin Man, Nick and Nora Charles kind of stuff. Just because I like that stuff. I like having characters who can bounce stuff off of each other and argue. Argue romantically.
Yeah.
And Arkham Horror is the same way. Like Alessandra Zorzi, who is the main character of the Arkham Horror series, has of course become a character in the game now. So she's in the card game. So I don't know whether that means it's more likely or less likely to get more books. I have no idea. I hope there'll be more of both. But if not, those are complete series. Like, you can read them and enjoy them, and then go on to play them in the games.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that was one of the genuine tragedies, I think, for the L5R world, that we won't get to see, or at least in its previous LCG incarnation, we don't get to see Daidoji Shin in the card game, which is a real shame.
He does have rules for the role-playing game edition from Fantasy Flight.
Right.
That someone from Aconite invented and put up as a free download for people.
Fantastic. That's great. I don't think I'd seen that. That's brilliant.
Yeah. They should still be available on the site, I think.
Right.
But it's rules for he and Kasami to use them in your games. And I think he appeared in a scenario run at some convention last year.
Okay.
Someone basically used him as a source that the characters could go to for information.
Right. So maybe like the Gen Con scenario.
Yeah. I think so.
Fantastic.
And apparently that was very popular. So I'm pleased by that. I'm pleased people like him. I'm glad people like him. I can honestly say the Daidoji Shin books are the books I have enjoyed working on the most since ever, really. because everything I've wanted to do, I've gotten to do. You know, a few tweaks here and there to make sure it stayed fit the tone and everything, but every idea I had was just like, yes, this is perfect. It's been great fun. I've really enjoyed it.
That was great. Well, fingers very firmly crossed that we do get some more of those stories in the future. I think that would be really terrific to see.
Yes, I hope so.
Well, Josh, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat to me. It's been so interesting and so much fun just to hear your perspective on your career and your work. So, yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I hope you don't get too many angry emails.
Well, I'm going to direct people to your blog in the description below. So I hope you don't get any angry comments off of the back of it. But I've really enjoyed reading your blog as well. So I hope people get involved there.
I hope so as well. Please do. Please follow. Buy my books. Give me money.
Huge thank you to Josh for sharing so many awesome stories. It was a genuine joy to chat. I really, really enjoyed it. If you would like to find out more about Josh's work, get access to his regular free short stories, and some of his classic horror movie reviews, you can do so via his blog, which I've linked in the description below. Thank you to my patrons for helping me prep for this interview, and if you would like to become a patron, you can check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. You'll get early and exclusive access to content, regular monthly giveaways, updates, Discord server access, and hopefully lots of other stuff that you will really enjoy, plus, of course, my eternal gratitude. You can also listen to my interviews as a podcast. Just search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery wherever you get your pods, and you should find it. You can also find the GW Films Club and the GW Books Club on podcatchers as well, if you're interested in those conversations. Thank you once again to Josh. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.